Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Joe Moeller. I am the co-host of Yuppies and Harpoons. With me is my regular Jacob. We're going to be talking about a pretty sensitive subject here today. We're going to be talking about what's going on over there in Israel and with the recent attack from Hamas in from the Gaza Strip. And we're going to go over quite a few details. We're going to probably look at the geopolitics of the events that probably led up to the attack. We're going to go into some of the situations that basically the situation that Gaza finds itself in, and lots more.
Yeah, and I think both of us kind of on that same page. I mean, the very most important thing is at this point, thousands have been killed, many thousands more have been injured, and many of these people are civilians. So whether they're Israelis or Palestinian, many were civilians, and I think that's the most devastating aspect. This is not a military versus military casualty, which that is sad in itself. But when you add in innocent civilians, people living their daily lives being attacked, there it's even that much more sad and devastating there. But to kind of rush up here, just quick recap of what happened over the weekend with this latest rise in conflict. And I don't even know if the language we use today might not be the best in describing. So just please forgive us and give us some grace there as we're trying to figure out what's going on here. But so it's kind of all kicked off in the latest conflict. So this kicked off Saturday morning about 6:30. Hamas, which is the party in power in the Gaza Strip, they invaded Israel. They breached several points within the fence, the barrier between Gaza and Israel, and they drove through the fence along with taking over some checkpoints, overwhelming the Israeli forces. This was a holiday weekend for Israelis. It was also Sabbath, which means that they were caught off guard, not to mention some pretty big military and intelligence failures for something like of this size to have happened, which is why it's being called things like the 9/11 of Israel, where Israel was really caught off guard and a large attack where many were killed took place. So 6:30 they entered, and over the next several hours there was a lot of really Hamas coming in and killing individuals, taking individuals as prisoners, bringing them back to Gaza Strip, and all while sending rockets over as well. So
Yeah,
it
the
was
numbers were staggering. It was like 2,500 missiles were fired.
right. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. So by 12 p.m., so just 6 hours later, there's 22 rockets confirmed sent over just that morning, and they'd continued throughout the day. This struck many buildings, but at the same time, Israel has the Iron Dome, which is protects Israel from a lot of rockets and missile strikes, essentially taking them out of the air. Although this did work on many of them, still plenty made it through and hit buildings and various forces. So the fighting kind of continued throughout the day until Israel was able to regain ground, get their footing. And at that point, a lot of the fighting had kind of ceased, and it went into Gaza had many prisoners that they brought back, and were going through the streets.
I think they took about probably 150 Israelis
150, yeah,
hostage, and a little bit of context for that. One of the things that that Hamas wants to use as leverage over the Israelis is normally the Israelis they don't whenever there's hostages taken, the amount of people that they have to release in order to get their people back typically is disproportionate. And so you can it's happened before, but sometimes the ratio can number from 10 to 1, where in order to get 100 Israelis back, it's probably going to take at least probably more, like a couple 100,000 Palestinians to be released from prison. And there's a whole lot of the issues here are so complicated. I have I grew up going to church with people who ended up going over and moving to into Israel, and I know people, and I even have some people in my personal life who are quite close to me who are from Palestine, and it's just anybody who says that the situation isn't complicated, clearly has one staked out position. And as the more and more I look into this, it's just it really is complicated. Like when you look at the just for prisoners, for instance, the amount of Palestinians that are in prison currently, the amount
Right.
of people that have been, the age, like they lowered, Israel lowered the age for the so that they can incarcerate 12-year-old boys and girls and put them in prison that are in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And so, you know, part of the argument you might hear from people on the Palestinian side for why they're taking hostages is because there are literally hundreds and thousands of people that are in prison, that have no links to terrorism. And but again, there's so much to unpack here, and we can
Mm-hmm.
go down an endless amount of rabbit holes. One of the things I definitely wanted to get into was some of the geopolitics here. One of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has prided himself as being somebody who his whole life's mission is securing the state of Israel, and this happening underneath his leadership is going to how he responds. It is going to define his legacy. There is no
Yes.
question about this.
And Benjamin
He
Netanyahu is a very controversial figure, to say the least. He, um, there's beliefs he's running just so that he can't be indicted, because when you're in a prime minister, you can't be indicted under Israel law. So there's some. He's a very controversial figure. He he's lost elections prior. He's been prime minister prior, but this is definitely a defining moment in
well, he
his
certainly
legacy.
he's also very interesting because he's always been a champion on the right in the United States, largely because he managed to do in as prime minister what no American politician has been able to do, which is to cut entitlements. Many people don't know this, but Israel, for a long time, was actually a heavily socialistic economy and had exceedingly high tax rates, and got in there and lowered and cut the entitlement state, and really became like a celebrity on the right, which then with his confrontation with Barack Obama, only made him a bigger and bigger star. And so he's very familiar in the conservative movement, and has a lot of conservative allies here in the United States. With that said, another key part of his legacy has been, I think few can argue, the unbelievable accomplishments of the Abraham Accords, where
Mm-hmm.
um, regardless of whether or not you agree with the Abraham Accords, the fact that Netanyahu was able to get them done is just it was unimaginable. The idea that you would have countries like Morocco, like Bahrain, like the UAE signing and entering into trade agreements with Israel back in, if that you were to say that to somebody back in 2005, they would have laughed at you in your
Right.
face. Um, and so these are massive developments that have occurred over the past 4 or 5 years. And there's been a lot of speculation that the chief country that's been pushing this acceptance of Israel as a state in the Arab world has been Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi
Mm-hmm.
Arabia has not come out and explicitly said that they support, you know, uh, you know, the way that Israel has run its country.
But they are
They
at the
they
negotiating tables and are looking to
they
put a
currently
deal
are.
together. And I
Right.
think
They
I think
currently
I think it'll be
good.
good. I think to really dive into that in a little bit later too, of why now Saudi Arabia is looking to negotiate with Israel. and what that
Well, I
what
think
type of
yeah. I
pressure
was just about
we'll see on that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a crucial point because Saudi Arabia and Israel were in talks, and they were about, and probably in the next couple of months, it was expected that some sort of a framework of a deal um, for full recognition of the state of Israel and bilateral trade agreements and entry from so citizens of Israel can visit Saudi Arabia and vice versa. Um, that the initial steps for that framework of a deal were on the verge of happening in Saudi Arabia today. There's a generational divide between young Saudis who are really of the crown prince's age and older Saudis who have a deep and sincere loyalty and care and regard for the Palestinian people. They believe that there should at least be a two-state solution, and that there should be no normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel unless there is a two-state solution where the Palestinians have their own state with their own sovereignty and their own rights. Whereas the younger generation in Saudi Arabia is a little bit more pragmatic, and that has a lot to do with the threat of Iran, and obviously Iran is a Shiite Muslim country, and Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Muslim country, and there's just a lot of division and a lot of suspicion between those two countries. And Iran has a serious interest in not allowing for there to be normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, because Israel is a very sophisticated, technologically innovative economy, and those two working together certainly poses a threat to Iran. And I think that there's a lot more that we can go into, but if we want to dip into the history a little bit as well, I think we can attempt that too. But I really wanted to try and just get people to understand that the timing of this attack is not coincidental. There are obviously events that were happening within the West Bank and within Gaza that
Right.
were certainly extremely provocative. There were 5 women outside a mosque who were led around bare naked, extremely conservative Muslims. Just totally humiliated in front of in Hamas, and people in Gaza were crying for this sort of stuff to stop. But this was a plan that was long in the making, because the talks between the Saudis and Israelis have been going on. The back channels have been going on for a long time now, and so this was something that has been in the works for quite some time to respond and to try to prohibit a union, or not a union, but a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Right. Yeah, and that's definitely a pretty major turning point too, of Saudi Arabia coming in and saying we're willing to recognize Israel as a state. You have Iran on the other hand, who is behind the scenes really orchestrating as much as they can, including supplying ammo and guns and weapons to different terrorist groups that would undermine Israel, financing different aspects as well. Iran's really trying to play, be the playmaker in the region, where at the same time you have Israel and countries are coming to Israel and finding peace agreements, only putting more pressure on Iran to step up their works there.
Well, and I do need to. I'm sorry. There was one other thing I had to say about that specifically, which
Mhm.
is Iran is leveraging Palestinian fear that the
Yes.
rest of the Arab world is abandoning them for security ties with Israel.
Right.
Iran knows that the Palestinian people are fearful of the fact that so many neighboring Arab countries have normalized relations with Israel,
Yes.
and because of that, they're exploiting it. And I think that that's if there's any point you can take away about the current situation on the ground there, that is one to take away.
Yes. hmm And that just compounds on top of all the other tensions and conflicts in this region. That is one of those areas where it's one of those things that's going to push people over, and you're going to see these attacks like you saw on Saturday. which are very they're not common. They Hamas and Israel, they're going back and forth constantly. Bombs being sent over constantly, but you haven't seen a level of attack like this until recently, and I think part of that's just the constant tension that's heating up, and it boiled over this past weekend, unfortunately. So I think some of the history, it really depends on who you ask where it starts. So if you ask someone from Israel, this is their land. This is the promised land. This is what Moses, when led the Israelians out of Egypt, Israelites, sorry, led the
Yeah.
Israelites out of Egypt. This is where they end up after 40 years in the desert. This is their promised land. God promised for them. Um, then you see Israel go in and out exile, and then for many generations there, not much happens. It goes back and forth between different groups trying to conquer it until the Ottoman Empire comes in. This is right after the Crusades, fairly far after the Crusades, but you kind of have this Muslim rule over the state of Israel, what we call Israel at this point. And so this all happens 1500s into the 1800s, when the Ottoman Empire falls, and this is after World War One. British comes in and are ruling over, which is Palestine at that point in time. It's not until 1948 that the state of Israel is formalized with the British mandate, and you create this state for essentially for the Jewish people after World War II. There was millions of Jewish people. Pretty much no country wanted them. They had been persecuted from the beginning, and so they always wanted a state that they could be their own. The idea being you can't erase a state completely, but you can erase people groups. So by having a state, they would make sure they wouldn't be able to be erased. But the whole Zionism movement that forms the state of Israel, you start seeing that in the 1800s. So you see migration really start in 1800s with tens of thousands of Jews, later hundreds of thousands of Jews coming into what is now the state of Israel. Meanwhile, Palestinian people living there still. So this all culminates into 1947. There's a war where they're expelled. The Palestinian people at the time are expelled, and they are pushed out. State of Israel is formed, and you see massive influx of Jewish people to the area since then. And
Yeah, it's worth noting.
go ahead.
Anyone who, when you look at the battle between Israelis and Palestinians, I don't think it's possible to draw a conclusion other than this is a problem that was created by Europe. This initially, Zionism isn't even something that originated in Judaism. It's actually a racist Christian development. It was a Christian idea
I
that the
don't
Jews
I don't know
needed
if
to.
I fully support that. Hussein's Christian wants to
Zionism.
yeah, I mean you really see that with the Jewish people who are, during the Holocaust are massacred. But that the Holocaust was one of many times the Jewish people have been, whether genocide or forced out or oppressed throughout history.
But
And so,
I'm virtually positive that
Zion
Zionism originated,
and
like the idea that the Jewish people would return to Israel and reestablish a Jewish state was something that Christians pointed to happening in being recorded in the Book of Revelation,
right,
and that was a belief that, well, this is a real rabbit hole. But during the during the Reformation, there was a huge debate in the church, because the understanding in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions was that Israel, the new Israel of the new covenant, is the church, and it's the body
right,
of Christ, and it's all people who claim to be in communion with the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
There were some Protestant theologians. Now, this wasn't necessarily out of racial animus against Jews, but there were some Protestant theologians who interpreted the word Israel literally to mean the actual Jewish people, um, and kind of parted ways with that understanding. And then in succession, there began to be a anti-Semitic, let's just deport them all. And then it was after those theological developments within Christianity, you actually see a Jewish Zionism come to fruition.
But
It's
Zion, that's not a unique thing. That's something they've always wanted because, the whole idea of the promised land to them, right? They had this land that was devoted to them. There was the land of milk and honey. It was a prosperous land that was stripped from them when they were sent to exile. They never regained that there. And there's always this, you know,
are you talking about
looking
biblical times or
more of modern day Zionism, uh, you know,
okay?
and so the Jewish people have always wanted this, restoration. Not all of them. Don't want to speak for all of them, but there's always been this sense of restoring what was once for them. And so you see it. You also see the Christian and what you're talking about coming in, and then you see that the two kind of merge, and it allows for this path to come forward.
Into some sort of cooperation.
Right. But, it's just as much as, the Jewish people who, I mean, during World War II, boats of Jewish people are coming to the shores of the U.S., of America, and we're turning them away, right? No one wanted the Jewish people. They've always been persecuted. Um, and, myths and different things created about them so that they would be less desirable people. So creating their own state allows them to have authority, allows them to have a stake in history. It's hard to erase a whole state, a whole country, but it's easy to erase people groups. So that's kind of a lot of the motivation from the Jewish standpoint. And again, I'm not Jewish, so maybe there's a lot more I'm missing here, but that's part from just as much Christian as Jewish is where the Zionist movement comes from. I mean, as early as in the 1800s, you see um, Jewish people moving to the Palestinian state and settling there, kind of with this mindset of this could be ours, this could be our state one day, and setting some of
Yeah,
those early seeds for then what would become in 1948 the state of Israel
right.
as we know it today.
Well, and what well and part of the also part of the background with with the revolution, and when Israel declared its independence from Britain, there's just so many political factors there. The Soviet Union was actually giving um, military support to the Israelis, um, and the British were giving basically defective military equipment to the Palestinians. And
Mhm.
part of that was because the Soviets didn't want the United States to develop a strong relationship with Israel, and kind of wanted to drive a wedge between U.S. policy and British policy. That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
It
But the
is.
big thing when it comes to the revolution is that there's something that the Palestinians talk about, which is known as the Nakba, which is basically the either the extermination or the forced exodus of Palestinians from their homes. So when
Right.
the Jews declared independence, they basically went through all of the lands that when you look at Israel and you look at inside, other than the West Bank and Gaza, they went down and they pretty much decimated all the Palestinian villages and created a massive refugee crisis,
Yes.
where a lot of Palestinians still live in either in Gaza or in the West Bank, and the
And
number
this
of
is
people that were either killed or moved. It varies by who you ask, but some people say the initial amount of people that were moved were well over 1 million, and their descendants today, at least in total, I think about 6 to 8 million people. And one of the things that people may not know, but I've come to know, is that a lot of Palestinian families that were expelled, this is just literally 2 generations ago, um, they still had the keys to the homes
Right.
where they used to live and where their families used to live, and there's a long desire of return to those homes. And so if you meet someone who's Palestinian, a lot of times what they'll have is they'll have like a grandparent or a great grandparent that grew up in an affluent home, bordering the Mediterranean. They were on the sea or something, and their parents actually grew up in a constant, in some sort of a refugee camp, because of just the massive upheavals of the revolution. Now, that being said, you have to acknowledge
Mhm.
what was happening in Europe. It's not like the Jews were given a much better bargain. They were literally being sought after to be exterminated by half of Europe,
Right.
and you know, it's like in the other countries weren't taking them in, and so the U.S. wasn't accepting them, the U.K. wasn't accepting them. So where exactly are you going to go? And it's again, I'm not gonna I can't cover everything that that both sides would try to argue here, but it's certainly a very 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 complicated set of circumstances, all based upon hatred,
Hmm.
and and that's really what it boils down to, is just pure hatred for other human beings. And as we'll get into today, with the
And on
situation in
top of that,
Gaza.
the
Yeah, go ahead.
hatred comes from both sides stating that this is their land. So you have this, limited amount of land, and you have Palestinians saying, "This is our land. We've been here for generations." And on the flip side, you have Israelites saying, "This is our land. We've been here for generations as well," because they go back thousands of years, and Palestinians can do the same. And what that leads to is just hatred for each other. And that's why the Palestinians still hold on to the keys, because they believe this is their land and they'll be able to go back home, even though it's been
Yeah.
several generations.
Well, if you go and you just open up, like I have a copy of Will Durant's, History of Civilization, and you just read about the place in Israel. Like if you learn about the land of Israel, it's called Palestine. It wasn't that long ago that it was called Palestine, and that's a very very offensive name to Jews, because the word Palestine was a word that the Romans
Hmm.
used as an insult. They took the name of Israel and they replaced it, in Judea, and they replaced it with Palestine. Actually, the word actually comes from Philistine, which
Right.
anyone who's literate in biblical history, um, and stories would know that the Philistines were an arch rival. David and
Yeah.
Goliath. Goliath
David and
is
Goliath.
a
Yep.
Philistine. And so the very name Palestine is just it has such it's such a derogatory term for any Jew, and it's it's just uh, anyway. And so of course no
Yeah.
Jews aren't going to want to
No.
call, they'll never refer to the land as Palestine. Never. It'll never happen. Um,
Mhm.
and so yeah, I think that those events still are creating the situation we have today,
Yeah. And I think
of
for
contributing
anyone
to.
who was born and raised in America or many Western societies, it's so hard for us to really grasp what it's like to be there, because you have two sides, and it's very clear that they're separate sides. One is all about Palestine, one is all about Israel, and the idea that they're going to come together and be peaceful, coexistent is very difficult to grasp when you start to meet and talk with people from both sides, because they each have such one, it's where they live, so they have that whole, this is where I live, this is where I eat, this is where I sleep, that whole side of it. But then they also have a very like deep understanding of, like, language matters a huge amount, so like names and things like that very much matter, where in America we don't really have that same amount of weight to certain things.
Right.
But culturally, it's a very sensitive thing, as it should be. I mean, you're talking about two people groups that really respect and weigh heavily on their historical context, and that
Yeah,
is
they're
being
inheritors
threatened.
of great tradition. I mean,
Yeah,
it's something I think that we need to actually jump into is kind of the current situation with what happened recently. We could go on forever about the history here,
right.
but what I wanted to try and touch on was we've heard for a long time that what Hamas did was an act of terrorism, and let me say unequivocally, it was an act of terrorism what they did. It absolutely was. When you look at the reports, when you see the beheaded children, the beheaded babies, the women who were stripped of their clothes and bore out naked and driven on the sides of jeeps,
The music
when you
festival where you have people
the music festival,
paratrooping in and killing hundreds of people as they're having fun at this festival. You know,
you see videos that were live streamed at that festival. All those people are dead.
right.
You see the cars and you see how there's families, in homes, running out the rooftops of their, opening their windows and running out onto the roof, and they're being shot. And you see the father. I saw a video of a father who was, running away. He was throwing his children out the window, and they were crawling onto the roof. And then Hamas soldiers had come into the home and shot him dead. Terrorism is terrorism is terrorism. And that is not to say that every single person who is a sympathizer to the Palestinian cause is a terrorist. It does not mean that. And I feel like there's been this really failure to distinguish the two. If you kill babies, I don't care what you claim to be. I don't care where you came from. If you kill mothers, I don't care where you came from. If you shoot up hospitals, I don't care where you came from. And what you hear, from the Palestinian side is that Israel has done the same thing to us.
Right.
And you want to know something? They're probably right. They're almost certainly right. And but the problem is nobody, whenever there's a conflict, because everyone thinks that the other person is more wrong, no one's willing to say that what happened was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the conversation actually needs to start. Now you can say that, well, why are we having the conversation now? Why are we having the conversation? Because Israeli children were killed. What about our children? Our children were thrown off buildings. Our children's schools were shut up. Nobody said a thing. Why now? And that's a valid point. That's a very valid point. You know what? Maybe clearly Western media has more of a prerogative for caring for Israeli children when they're shot than Palestinian children. Okay, but what I would like to tell people who are supporters of the Palestinian movement is that if you want your movement to be recognized and to
Mm-hmm.
be accepted and for people to give it attention, you cannot try to condone the actions of Hamas first. You have
Correct.
to condemn Hamas and what it did first, okay? And then talk about how we prevent events like this happening in the future. And then you can go into the things about the situation in Gaza. I think it's extremely understandable about what happened in Gaza, about how the actions of the Israeli government created this situation where something like this was inevitable. I think that's obvious. Okay, but to start out with a conversation with people who honestly are already susceptible to Western media, then what? Then the burden is on you, whether you like it or not. You have to make your case, and you can't start off by saying, "I will not condemn when babies are killed and women are raped."
Mm-hmm.
You can't start there.
Right.
And I say this as somebody that I have looked at and I have been sent endless amounts of material on the awful things that Israeli soldiers do on a daily basis to Palestinians, and it's awful. It's awful.
Right. And this is where I think
And,
it's
and anyway,
important too for this particularly is to separate. Hamas is a recognized terrorist group by the UN, by the US. This is the party that was elected to power in 2006 or 2007, and Hamas can be separated from the Palestinian people, the civilians who are living their lives and are not actively engaging and chanting death to Israel. There's a difference. Hamas, though, their mission is to eradicate Jews from this section of the world, and really, I think from the rest of the world, if you follow what they preach, Hamas is a terrorist organization, and it's hard to really separate from that. At the same time, you see Israel, and they have. I mean, I think Joe, you did a decent job of getting started at some of the oppressive nature of Israel. And again, this can go. You can look at Israel as a government and a country, and then the Israel as people, and they're kind of separate. Um, but that's a big thing. And if you don't condone Hamas's actions, then
If you don't
what do
condemn, get
yeah,
that right.
condemn. So, where what would it take for you to do so at this point after what happened this past weekend, and any chance of a two-state solution? We're not even going to go that any chance that Hamas gets what they want. Let's talk about like a two-state solution, like a moderate stance. That's off the table at this
Yeah.
point after this
Well,
weekend.
and that's
Any
the
progress
problem,
that
right?
could
I
have
mean,
been made is gone because right now
yeah.
there's blood on the hands of Hamas, and Israel is going to fight. Israel has a strong military. They're one of the most well-equipped countries because they know that the constant threat of attack is there. They have had war after war after war and constant daily threats. They are well suited for a fight, and the people have risen up. Hundreds of thousands have come as reserves already just in the days after the attacks. This is a country willing to fight, and by essentially provoking them, what did this gain for Hamas
With it,
besides
exactly,
besides getting a few headlines, but really revealed a lot of colors
and
for
that's
where
why
Hamas
I
is.
want. No, and that's the thing that I want to try to make clear is that this was something that the Iranian government is using the fear
Yes.
of Palestinians from being abandoned by their Arab neighbors to incentivize and to fund, I believe. I mean, that hasn't
Yes.
been officially confirmed, but to fund this sort of activity. But let's dive into Gaza because I think Gaza is just it's screaming for our attention right now. Well,
It
for those
is.
who don't know, that there's basically two Palestinian territories within Israel. There's the West Bank, and then there's the Gaza Strip. All right, the Gaza Strip is separated from the West Bank. It's probably about a 40-minute drive if you were to actually like go from the West Bank, the southernmost part of the West Bank, to Gaza. But Gaza, since 2006, nobody's been able to leave and enter Israel, and the border between Gaza and Egypt is also locked. And so, part of that agreement, there was an agreement with Israel that with Egypt that Egypt really wouldn't permit people in Gaza to leave and go through their border crossing, and Israel is just pretty much totally banned with some rare exceptions, people entering Israel from Gaza. So,
Right.
because of that, there are actually two governments in the Palestinian territories. In the West Bank, you have what's called the Palestinian Authority, and in Gaza, you have what's called Hamas. In
Hmm.
2006, when there was an agreement reached that basically Israel would pull out of Gaza. Prior to 2006, there are, I think, about 10,000 Israeli settlers that were living in Gaza. There were Israeli soldiers that were located in Gaza, and there was an agreement that ultimately, due to with some concessions and so on, that Israel would pull out its soldiers along with its settlers, the Israeli settlers, from Gaza, and ultimately let it elect its own government. And the people did elect its own government. They elected the leaders of Hamas, and they have been in control of the Gaza Strip ever since. Now, there's more context that's needed. There's a lot of I wouldn't call it propaganda, but I would say just bad information So maybe that is not propaganda. I don't know.
I think that's
But
the yeah.
there's just some incorrect facts going around about Gaza, and because people have been saying, well, the Palestinian people, they had their own people, and then they elected Hamas. And listen, I don't think it's ever good to elect people like like Hamas. I think that's just a bad electoral decision. But when you look at what's happening in Gaza, Israel still controls the water supply. They give the people living in Gaza about 4 hours of electricity. They have complete control over the amount of electricity that flows
That
into
is
Gaza.
actually down to 3 hours at this point.
It's
3 hours
down
of
to 3 hours
electricity
a week.
a day.
Down
Yeah,
to 3 hours.
I think
Was
it's
it a
3 hours
day?
a day that they're allowing. We should
Okay,
probably fact check
maybe.
that, but very
Well,
very
you know what?
minimal.
You know what? Okay, yeah, 3 hours a day. Let's just say that 3 hours a day. That's try to operate on 3 hours a day of electricity a day. That's um, and so they control their water supply. They control their electricity. Um, they have complete control of Gaza's airspace. They control what goods enter in and out of Gaza, so they can cut out all trade that's exported outside of Gaza. Israel has complete control over, and they have an agreement with Egypt to prevent people from leaving Gaza if they don't try to leave Gaza through Israel, which there's a complete ban. So nobody can leave. So if you're born in Gaza, which is about 22 miles by 10 miles,
It's about
22
twice the
miles long by
size of the District
yeah
of Columbia, DC,
yeah
for
yep,
context.
you can't do it. You can't leave. And so about 40% of the people in Gaza are unemployed. About 60% of the people living in Gaza are beneath the poverty line. And over half of the population is below the age of 19.
Hmm.
I mean, think about
And
that for a second.
there's
That, go ahead.
2.3 million people in this area.
Yeah,
Highly concentrated, one of the most highly concentrated areas in the world in this small little strip.
right. And so create a situation like that where you prevent people to leave, and again, you have water, you don't have independent access to water and electricity, and you can't really conduct trade on your own. Um, like it just festers this hazardous this basically this hazardous situation of hopelessness, of meaninglessness, of drugs, all of which are just infested all throughout Gaza.
Hmm.
People don't have any meaning in their lives. If you were secluded on a plot of land that was again twice the size of the District of Columbia, and you've never been able to leave that for your whole life, that's something I can't even begin to relate to.
Yeah,
And and so I think that understanding that, and then that the attack came out of this area, was it wrong? Yes. It's not right to kill children. It's not right to rape women. It's not right to just shoot people for the hell of it. It's wrong. Okay? But what exactly do we expect to happen when you treat human beings like this? That's kind of the and what sort of policies do we want to try to implement in the future to basically to prevent these um, hostile environments from arising?
and I think what you're saying isn't conflicting with what you said earlier, right? Like the fact that what happened is a terrorist act, what happened was horrible and should never be done before. But then on the flip side, you
It
can
was terrorism.
understand
Yes.
why it built up and why this happens. It's the situation that people in the Gaza Strip are living in. Like you said, they don't have a purpose because there's no way for them to have a purpose in the situation that they're living in.
Well, make another point, Jacob. There are people whose families were separated in Gaza when people in Gaza could no longer leave Israel, and it became its own sovereign, in quotation marks, entity. Um, you know, there are families that haven't been able to see each other for almost 20 years now, where
Right.
some of the people that I know that are Palestinian, their families have not. Basically, the only way they stay connected with them is now over FaceTime, which they've only had access to over like in the last 4 or 5 years. Before that, they had hardly any communication with them at all, and they live about 40 minutes apart,
Mm-hmm.
to 60 minutes, and they haven't seen them in 15, almost 20 years. And
Right.
so we are talking about a set of circumstances I don't think people fully appreciate. Now with that said, there is another distinction between the territories, which is that the Palestinian Authority is in control of the West Bank, and Hamas is in control of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority has acknowledged that the state of Israel has a right to exist. Hamas does not, and so there is a extra level of hostility that the Israeli government has towards get the Gaza Strip, because they elected a government that is in its charter solely interested in dismantling the Israeli state. All foreign aid, whether it comes from the EU, the UN, or the United States, when you hear that there's aid that's going to Palestinians in Gaza, the recipients of that aid are Hamas.
Right.
And
Who have
so,
now become some of the wealthiest individuals. The leader of Hamas have become one of the
yes.
wealthiest individuals in the world.
Yep. Yes, exactly. And so, while there's a very compelling case, and again, I have a lot of sympathy for Palestinians that are suffering in Gaza, and there has to be an acknowledgement that part of the reason, certainly is part of the reason that there hasn't been any development, why there is so much hopelessness in Gaza, has a lot to do with the actions that Israel has taken and the restrictions they place on Gaza. Some things that cannot be ignored, though, are the fact that Hamas does not use the foreign aid that the United States, that the UN, that the EU provides it for ways that actually help build up the Gaza Strip. They do it to enrich themselves and to fund their and to buy weapons, and basically to build up and prepare for military actions like we saw a couple days ago.
And this is where the Israel argument comes into play, where the part of the agreement was Gaza would be this land for them to self-govern, self-rule. There would be a movement towards a two-state solution, which would be kind of the solution to avoid this conflict. Israel's then turning around saying billions of dollars of aid has been provided to the Gaza Strip, and what has been done with it? All the utilities essentially are still relying on Israel, the water, electricity. None of this has been investments into the Gaza infrastructure, the Gaza people. It's just been going to build up the military and build up the wealth of the leaders of Hamas rather than helping the people of Palestine. And so, Israel can sit back and I'm going to say, see, we did our part. We made a consensus, and what did that do? It backfired. Now we have this small little area that is under occupation, and all these conflicts are happening. Why are we even negotiating with Palestinians if this is the outcome? And so it kind of fuels their argument on the Israeli side, by Hamas corruption and Hamas undermining the Palestinian people and the people that elected them to serve. So it doesn't help the case whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, it's just it's a tragedy for certain. And I think we're probably approaching the hour here, so we'll need to cut it short probably relatively soon. But I wanted to just make just another point that regardless of where you are on a situation on this issue, you know an awareness to suffering is a virtue. And one of the greatest people um, I've ever met is my priest here in Concord, and every Sunday he does a a wonderful job of just thinking about or staying attuned to the tragedies that are happening around the world and bringing them up in prayer during Mass. And, I think one area where people who consistently find themselves supporting Israel could really do themselves a favor is to not only be aware of the sufferings of Israelis. I want people to hear me very clearly. The sufferings that Israelis have suffered over the past couple of days have been atrocious. They've been awful. Okay, and they deserve our compassion. They deserve our sympathies, and we should keep their families in our prayers. With that said, we have a responsibility to be aware of all suffering. We have a responsibility to be cognizant of not just Israeli suffering, but also the suffering that happens at the hands of Israelis when it comes to how they treat people in the West Bank and how they treat people in the Gaza Strip. I think that that's something that we have a responsibility to, as people to do, and I don't see why that would be remotely controversial. I don't think that that's me being pro or anti-Israel. Frankly, I think it's an awareness to suffering, as I said earlier, is a virtue, and I think that honestly, when people evaluate issues, when they are intentional with identifying suffering, no matter what the skin color or nationality the person is, it benefits all humanity, and everyone will feel that they're recognized. Everyone will feel like they're being heard if we all make a point to be open to and be mindful of the suffering of everybody. And so that's really all I have to say.
Yeah. I think on that note, another episode of Yuppies and Harpoon. And yeah, I mean, not an easy topic, a lot more for us to unravel as the days and weeks to come regarding Israel and Palestine, and definitely not an issue that's going to go away anytime soon. But thanks for joining us, and like and subscribe. And
Actually, one more thing before people go. If you want to
go,
learn a little bit about the history of just some of the conflict, not just between Israelis and Palestinians, because that's that's a real, that's actually a very specific conflict unique to our present time in the past 100 years. But if you really want to learn about the complexities of the history of Israel and in the land that it's on, and specifically like the city of Jerusalem, I would recommend the book Jerusalem by a man named Simon Montefiore. It just kind of gives a great summary of how no matter who's had control of Jerusalem, it's always gone to hell. And so it's whether it was the Christians, whether it was the Muslims, or whether it was the Jews, it's always been a problem. And I found it to be a very, very human book, to be frank. It was just a book that I felt like could have been a great biography about human beings. So, but yeah, with that, I think that's a good note to end. And I know this was a sensitive topic, but I think it was necessary to talk about. So we appreciate you listening, and like Jacob said, like and subscribe, and we'll be back next week. Jacob?
Yuppies and Harpoons. Thanks for joining.
Yuppies and harpoons. Yeah. All right. See you guys.
See ya.